Even when I lose my head, guillotine.
The guillotine is one of the most oft-referenced symbols of revolution by socialists and by the wider pop culture. People gleefully and humorously discuss guillotining landlords and beheading the bourgeoisie in memes and discussion boards. I also found it exciting at first. I played a lot of Assassin's Creed Unity, and the thought of the great masses rushing our exploiters and finally ending our exploitation truly thrilled me. But it was just a fantasy. I knew deep down that I had no intention of beheading anyone, and the normalization of the guillotine in the discourse does worry me a bit, so let's talk about it. The guillotine is widely recognized as the execution method of choice during the French Revolution. A contraption of efficient and supposedly painless execution, it was first introduced in France in the late 1700s, thanks to the efforts of Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotine, though similar beheading machines were in use across Europe as early as the 13th century. Approximately 17,000 people were guillotined during the Reign of Terror, including Louis XVI, and after the French Revolution, it was used by various French powers to industrialize death, up to the abolition of capital punishment in 1981. Maximilien de Robespierre, the most famous of the Jacobins, made a habit of consolidating power through the guillotine. He used the working class against the moderate Girondists faction, who were also Republicans. After guillotining them, he made it quite clear that he didn't care for the poor, the Jacobins, or anyone else. His goal was to secure his autocratic government's reign. Grassroots who? Robespierre and his allies continued to send other radicals to the guillotine, including the Enrages and the Herbatists, proto-feminist Olympe de Gouges, childhood friend Camille Desmoulins, and his wife, whose sister was Robespierre's own fiancée. He also got long-term ally Georges Danton and his supporters under the blade as well. And also, I don't care too much about properly pronouncing French names, so let's move on. Not so surprisingly, most of those slaughtered under his watch were not aristocrats or capitalists. Between 1793 and 1794, only 8% of the 16,594 executions were doled out to aristocrats, and only 6% to members of the clergy. The rest of the victims were primarily working class. But let me pull away from Robespierre for a moment. Not many people know of the guillotine's uses outside of France. It was a weapon in the arsenal of French colonialism. People forget that the French Revolution was spearheaded by capitalists who wanted to get the aristocracy out of the way, and them capitalists were collecting coin from their brutal overseas slave colonies. They might have been shouting liberté, égalité, fraternité, but they wanted to keep their slaves in colonial holdings. Naturally, they exported the guillotine industry abroad. I couldn't find records of the guillotine's use in Haiti, Guadeloupe, or Martinique, so if you have those resources, feel free to drop them below. In French Guyana, which was basically a penal colony, it was used to behead prisoners, and French authorities freely executed criminals and political prisoners in Indochina, which is now Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. In fact, the South Vietnamese dictator Ngo Dinh Diem continued to use the guillotine to suppress the rural population. In the so-called New Caledonia that France used as a penal colony for tens of thousands in 1864, the Kanak people, who had been relegated to reservations, were continuously revolting. Their resistance culminated in 1878 with the insurrection of the Comali Great Chief Atai, who united the nations of the island and launched a guerrilla war that led to the death of 200 Frenchmen and 1,000 Kanaks. In an effort to crush the insurrectionist spirit, the French colonial administration condemned 10 Kanaks to death and publicly executed them by guillotine in front of the chiefs and population of their clan in a place called Uvanu. Today, a memorial stands in the same place to commemorate the massacre. In Algeria, the colonial tool was used liberally as early as 1843. During the Algerian Revolution, which lasted from 1954 to 1962, the scope of actions that could be punishable by death was expanded by the French colonial government in an effort to maintain their rule. 2,300 Algerian revolutionaries were condemned to death, and although over 90% of them were never executed, over 100 of them were executed one by one in the prison. But France isn't the only European power to wield the guillotine so widely and brutally. It was used in Greece, Switzerland, Belgium, and Sweden as a method of capital punishment, but they all abolished it long before France did. I'm mostly talking about Germany though. The German Empire and Weimar Republic both used it alongside the firing squad, and even contributed their own innovations to the machine. Naturally, when the Nazis rose to power, they were all too happy to use the death machine in their quest to cleanse Germany. Between 1933 and 1945, Nazi Germany executed a staggering 16,500 prisoners, 10,000 of which took place between 1944 and 1945 alone. One of the most famous of these executions was Sophie Scholl, an anti-Nazi activist of the White Rose Resistance Group. She and her brother Hans were found guilty of high treason for distributing anti-Nazi pamphlets, and they were both executed via guillotine in 1943. After the war, the guillotine continued to be used, this time to execute Nazis, as late as 1949 in West Germany and 1966 in East Germany. Long before the Nazi regime or the cascade of revolutions against French rule, socialist revolutionaries at the Paris Commune burned the guillotine. Many of those same revolutionaries were later shipped off to French penal colonies. As the blueprint for revolution that inspired Marx, Bakunin, and countless other theorists, it begs the question, why did they burn the guillotine? Let's return to Robespierre. He himself was guillotined, with few supporters in his corner, considering, he killed them. But was his tyranny unique to Robespierre? Honestly, if you really think about it, no. He just filled a role that many were vying for in the grand competition for centralized dictatorial power. Not long after Robespierre's death, Napoleon Bonaparte seized power and declared himself emperor in 1804. After his failure in 1815, there was the Bourbon Restoration that attempted to restore the Ancien regime, which then fell to the July Revolution that established the July monarchy in 1830. Not long after that, poor folks were kinda sick of the monarchy, so they overthrew them in the French Revolution of 1848. In February, they restored Republican power, and by June they realized the new government was no better, so they revolted again. This time though, the army massacred the people, setting the stage for the rise of Napoleon III in 1848, and 3 years later, the abolition of the Republic and his crowning as the new Emperor of France. After Napoleon III's capture, the Third Republic was established in 1870, and a year later, Adolphe Thiers destroyed the Paris Commune. In 1873, even more reactionary forces supplanted him. And all this time, France continued to colonize and butcher brown folks overseas. Now can you imagine why the Paris Commune would storm the prison in Paris almost exactly 150 years ago today, on April 6, 1871, to, amidst cheers, seize, smash and burn the guillotine, at a time when the Commune was threatened by French and Prussian armies to impose the conservative Republican government? Burning the guillotine was a brave and necessary repudiation of the Reign of Terror, and the notion that positive social change can be achieved by mass slaughter. But it would be a mistake to see the tragedy of the French revolutions as the falls of just the tool used. We have to examine the logic behind it too. For a tool that slaughtered thousands of working class folks within and outside France, that was wielded to colonize and genocide and subjugate, we have to ask, why do folks today see the guillotine as a symbol of liberation? The symbol of the guillotine as a tool of the state. It's very strange to me that socialists would want to associate with the Jacobins, considering how the French Revolution laid a lot of the groundwork for the modern capitalist nation-state. The state, described by Max Weber, is an entity that achieves a monopoly in the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. States are basically free to wield lethal force with impunity. Before the revolution, French monarchs freely beheaded their subjects. During the revolution, the Jacobins baptized their rule in the beheaded blood of the old social order, and anyone else that stood in their way. After the revolution, French states and colonies continued to wield the guillotine on its population. The Jacobins were actually closer to the forerunners of Augusto Pinochet and Benito Mussolini, not modern socialist revolutionaries. The guillotine they so loved was one of the first instruments of capitalist violence. Capital punishment is one of the worst excesses of state violence, and not something we should be replicating. There's nothing revolutionary about an institutionalized process of top-down murder. The state, as we can see, has the power to kill, harm, and coerce, but not to give life, freedom, support, and solidarity. Socialist revolutionaries who insist on wielding state power must embrace what CrimethInc dubbed the logic of the guillotine to acquire that power. But just as they can use that power to crush other revolutionaries, that power can also be used against them. Take Vladimir Lenin. He described Robespierre as a Bolshevik avant la lecture, which is a fancy way of saying that he was one of the first Bolsheviks before Bolshevism even existed. He even erected a statue of Robespierre in Moscow in 1918. It seems fitting that the Reign of Terror would be seen by Lenin as a precursor to the Bolshevik project. Just as Lenin was preparing to butcher the socialists and anarchists of the Kronstadt uprising, he proudly proclaimed that we'll be our own Thermidor, referring to the French Republican month that marks Robespierre's execution, and is forever associated with the counter-revolution. In essence, Lenin was saying that the Bolsheviks would survive the rebellion by becoming the counter-revolution themselves. Not long after their victory over the last major revolt against Bolshevik power, Lenin would introduce state capitalism to the USSR. I'm not sure if you noticed, but there's a not insignificant contingent of socialists who fetishize the state. They celebrate an instrument of murder that has always been used chiefly against us, and will quite possibly be used against them too. Reminding them of the many atrocities and betrayals of state socialists in the 20th century only seems to reinforce the appeal. The experiences of those victims of the USSR and China's excesses are completely abstract to them. It's a lot easier to just put one's faith in a mighty state. People want to see the state that crushes them turned against their enemies. Folks want revenge. The symbol of the guillotine as revenge. I mean, this is an open admittance of many who crowd for the guillotine. They want revenge. Uncompromising, bloody revenge. States and capitalists are destroying our planet, and us, while all the isms and modes of oppression seem to intensify. People feel powerless, and it makes sense on some level that folks would see state violence as a potential good if the right people were in charge. Plus, the guillotine is appealing because it keeps their hands somewhat clean. It's efficient and distant, impersonal and orderly, automated. Like a reflection of the capitalist state we want to abolish. Can I admit something? I occasionally fantasize about Jeff Bezos, and then of course, the British monarchy, and the entire US government, and every single member of the police with my bare hands. I'm human. The depths of my fury know no bounds. If you're too apathetic to feel the outrage I do over the state of our world, you really should be paying more attention. But you know what? I can't let that primal desire control me. I have to be able to separate my desire for revenge from my politics. Revenge is not the path to liberation. It's not part of my quest for liberation. And don't get me wrong, I'm under no illusion that revolution will be entirely peaceful. I mean, I literally made a nearly hour-long world-building video explaining why it can't be. And not to say that I wouldn't make mistakes either. But truthfully, some folks are vengeful and bloodthirsty because of the violence they've had to endure. I think you can accept that and work through that and do what you need to do. But don't pretend such brutality is going to advance our cause. As a symbol, the guillotine reflects the ways in which our minds have been infected. I'm reminded of the mask. The prison industrial complex replicates itself in our very minds. We stand in judgment, anointed with the blood of the wicked. We fall into the trap of determining the righteous and the damned. But what the guillotine should remind us of is the danger of becoming what we hate. To give hope to the many oppressed and fear to the few oppressors, that is our business. If we do the first and give hope to the many, the few must be frightened by their hope. It is not revenge we want for poor people, but happiness. Indeed, what revenge can be taken for all the thousands of years of the sufferings of the poor? We have to resist the urge to be cruel. If we're serious about changing the world, we have to do better. Our fight is not against human beings, it is against social phenomena. Our enemies are not a type of people. They fill a role in a system of fundamental antagonisms. Abolishing the ruling class doesn't mean guillotining everyone who owns a yacht or penthouse. It means making it impossible for anyone to systematically wield coercive power over anyone else ever again. Let our fantasies reflect our liberation, not our oppression. Our aim is collective freedom, not power over others. We can commit to the struggle without holding life cheap. Folks might argue that the massacres of past revolutions were justified for X or Y reason, but every massacre attempts to justify itself. Don't get it twisted, the question isn't about whether such massacres would make revolutionaries popular. States have always done far, far worse than the revolutionaries they have demonized. The question is about whether or not such activities have a place in the project for liberation. Just because we discard naive pacifism and recognize that blood will be spilled, that doesn't mean we should encourage bloodlust. We cannot be operating by their logic if our aims are so antithetical to their own. You gotta ask, how do we make it impossible for our oppressors to continue oppressing us? I'm not arguing that we don't use force, I'm arguing about how we use force without recreating oppression. Revolutionaries can use force to defend and expand their gains without hierarchical, centralized leadership. In fact, the revolutionary premise can and has worked to subvert, destabilize, and undermine the enemy's authority. We've seen defections and mutinies throughout history, but when we maintain guillotine logic, we foreclose our possibilities. We don't need to slaughter or exterminate when we can simply defeat. When we use force, let us never lose sight of our aspirations, our compassion, and our optimism. As Subcomandante Marcos de the Zapatistas put it, our vision is a world in which many worlds fit, a world in which the only thing that is impossible is to dominate and oppress. We desire to provide for all at the expense of none, to be valued as humans and not as commodities, and to live in harmony and not competition. There are no shortcuts to lasting change, not by the blade, not by the marketplace of ideas. But we can interrupt the ways capitalism and the state reproduce themselves, by any means necessary, while demonstrating the liberatory potential of our alternative, if not for our enemies, then at least for their children. The Bolsheviks described themselves as the Russian Jacobins, and they too, quite fittingly, defiled the revolution. In her book, My Disillusionment in Russia, the anarcha-feminist Emma Goldman wrote quite eloquently that today is the parent of tomorrow. The present casts its shadow far into the future. That is the law of life, individual and social. Revolution that divests itself of ethical values thereby lays the foundation of injustice, deceit, and oppression for the future society. The means used to prepare the future become its cornerstone. Peace. Hey, so new Patreon post talking about the revolution against one of the old kings of my fictional Caribbean solarpunk world. Check it out. Otherwise, thank you for watching. Thanks once again to the family, Ongrad, Kobe Tamayo, John Vaishi, Orishimoni, NP, Some Guy, Seth, J. Dorrance, Ipa, and Swafkata Jones. You can join these beautiful humans and support me too on patreon.com/sayingtrue. Please like, comment, subscribe, and share with your fellow peoples. Be the algorithm. Check out my previous videos for other fascinating topics. You can follow me on Twitter @_sayingtrue. Thanks again. Peace.